Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
Beautiful. So, welcome everyone to the Adult Child in Recovery podcast. My name is Vanzana. My website is vanzanalifehealing.com. And I'm really happy to introduce my guest today, who is another adult child fellow traveler. So, welcome, Barb. Thank you for coming on the show today.
thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited for this conversation. Love rapping with an adult child.
Yes, and we're so rare, or it's not that we're so rare, it's just hard to find each other with, uh, all the information or misinformation on the internet. It's just so special when I find another fellow traveler who has actually, worked the 12 steps that's unique to ACA adult
Mhm,
children of
mhm,
alcoholics or dysfunctional families with
mhm,
para-alcoholic parents. But we
mhm.
can get into that whole description and all the 14 laundry traits and things like that. But right now, I'd love to introduce you to whoever's meant to hear you. So let me just make sure I have your bio here. I want to make sure we're also recording. So let me just go back. Yep, we are. Perfect. Okay, so Barb, after decades of therapy, self-help books, retreats, workbooks, and more, Barb got into the 12 step. She discovered the 12-step recovery programs at age 52. Yep, I just started a couple of years ago myself. So, and you did this when you hit a codependent bottom or a rock bottom. It's more commonly, heard of that term, rock bottom. Um, and all those decades of self-help stuff didn't really, I mean, just you were just scratching the surface of the iceberg, right? There, and where the recovery kind of this recovery process melted the iceberg of your life, so to speak.
Mhm.
Um, and we're going to talk about boundaries today, which I know it's a very important part of the recovery process for adult children, because boundaries are the antidote to codependence. And boundaries actually permeate in every area of our lives, and they really change everything for you,
Mhm.
which I'm really happy to hear. It's very inspirational. And let's see, you're in the first and only healthy romantic relationship of your life. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And this is due to, you say it's due to your recovery, especially your boundary setting skills.
Mhm.
Um, for all those reasons and more, you've become a boundaries coach. So
Yep.
that's really awesome. So you're a boundaries coach, speaker, and founder of the and CEO of Higher Power Coaching and Consulting LLC. You're also a host of the podcast Fragmented to Whole: Life Lessons from 12-Step Recovery. And I'm not going to go into your whole bio right now, but can you tell me about this turning point for you at age
Yeah.
52?
Yeah. So I was working full time at Yale University at the time. I was a program coordinator for urban education, prevention, and policy research. And so I was behind the scenes running programs in urban schools. And I was also on the program and evaluation team. And I was volunteering at my church to serve, run a program that served homeless people. And right around that time, a homeless guy named Dan started coming to my church as a member, as a parishioner. And he and I became very friendly. And I took it as like, oh, this is a higher powered sign. I'm getting to know a homeless person as a friend so that when I run this project that serves homeless people, they are homeless people, not just the homeless. And a couple months into our friendship, we had a really bad snowstorm here in New Haven, Connecticut. So I invited Dan to stay at my home, which I now know is not normal. And he did. And then he stayed another time and another time. And within a few weeks, he was practically living with me. And I very soon felt trapped in my own home. So I was talking about him in therapy one day, and mid sentence, I stopped and I went, oh my God, do you think I need to go to Al-Anon? He was a self-proclaimed addict and alcoholic. I now think on reflection, perhaps he might have also had a personality disorder. And my therapist said yes. So I'll tell you, Vandana, I don't know what I put into the search engine, but I was looking for Al-Anon and I came across the word codependent. And I was bowled over because I had never heard this word. I had been in therapy for literally 37 years, not continuously, but starting at age 15. And, as you mentioned, all this personal development. So I started going to Codependence Anonymous and very quickly felt a sense of relief. And I remember saying to someone who may have been Dan, I think I need to reparent myself, but I didn't know that was a thing. I thought I made it up. 6 weeks into going to CODA, I go up to Cape Cod, Massachusetts to visit my friends, one of whom had been in AA for 10 years. And she had always just raved about how utterly transformed her life was. And I was like, oh, you're going to love it. I'm going to CODA, Codependence Anonymous. She's like, oh my God, this is great. Let's see if we can find a CODA meeting while you're here and we'll go. Well, she couldn't, but she found an ACA meeting, which I had heard of as ACOA. I now know they're the same.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, it was adult children of alcoholics. It never occurred to me that I qualified, but I knew she did because her dad was an alcoholic. So I'm like, I'll go for you. And we walk in, and, you know, in the opening readings, they say, we reparent ourselves. And I was like, what? And then they read the 14 traits of an adult child, or the
Mm-hmm.
laundry list. And I was like, oh my God. So my friend Heidi tells me I sobbed the whole meeting. I don't remember that, but I bought the big red book and the yellow 12-step workbook, came home to New Haven, Connecticut, found a meeting, started going. Very soon after, within a matter of weeks, a Friday night women's meeting started. I still go to that meeting. That's my home group. The Wednesday night big red book meeting I started with went defunct during the pandemic. A few weeks later, I started doing the 12 steps in a small group with other women. And I was just absolutely shocked at how everything, I was reading the big red book and I'm like, oh my God, I felt like someone had been filming the inside of my head. I was like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. This is what happened. This is what happened. I didn't know something, quote, happened to me. Well, of course, I soon found that the program is actually called Adult Children of Alcoholics and Dysfunctional Families. For that, I
Yes.
qualify. And I started hearing people talking about trauma. And when I started, Vandana, most of the people in the room had been practically brutalized as children. I was not brutalized, like physically brutalized,
Same here.
but I
Yeah.
knew I had the traits. And I was like, why do I belong here? And for the first 6 months, it was like I was almost like making excuses for why I was there. And I finally, when I got that trauma can result from the absence of good things happening, I was like, oh, that's me. And then I later learned someone said that trauma can result from unmet needs. And
Yes.
that really resonated with me. Well, a year into my recovery, I decided to let go of CODA because it was maybe like a 75%, ACA was 100% fit. I wasn't seeing and feeling and experiencing the kind of recovery that I was in ACA. That turned out to be a higher powered moment for me because I had been going to CODA on Monday nights. Meanwhile, one of my friends that I was doing the steps with had started going to Overeaters Anonymous and was slowly trying to kind of get me to go to that. And so I went to a meeting, and it turns out that they have a Monday night meeting in downtown New Haven. I didn't even know that compulsive eating was a thing. Never mind that I was that. I'm now down over 100 pounds from my top weight. And that program, we call it being abstinent. So I've been abstinent for, in April was 8 years. I've been in
Mm.
ACA since April of 2016. No, 2015. So I've been in recovery for 9.5 years altogether. And, you know, as you said in my intro, I feel like recovery has melted the iceberg of my life. I think part of it is that the 12 steps are just incredible. I think another part is really important part was dealing with the trauma that I didn't even know that I had. And then there's the reparenting. And, you know, I'd like to, I'll go into any one of those areas that you want me to, but I learned how to build healthy boundaries in this haphazard, meandering path while I was doing recovery. It's not like, and most of the time I didn't even understand that I was working on boundaries. And before I say more about that, I want to tell you there was two guys that I know from ACA who both have over 30 years in ACA and AA. And both of them said to me in slightly different ways at different times, in AA, it doesn't say in the 12 steps, stop drinking, but clearly you cannot recover if you don't stop drinking. In
Mhm.
ACA, it doesn't say in the steps, you need to build healthy boundaries, but clearly you cannot recover in ACA without healthy
Mhm.
boundaries because you don't know who you are. You don't know where you end and other people begin, what's okay with you, what's not okay with you, what you like, want, need, and prefer. And ironically, it was the boundary building process that taught me all of that stuff, that got me to, I think I liked myself, but I grew to love myself. I didn't know that I didn't have self-worth until recovery. But when I looked back at my life, it was like, that is not the behavior of a woman who feels worthy. I built self-worth. I didn't trust myself. That I did know. I built self-trust. And all of that happened through the boundary building process, which took me maybe like 2 to 3 years because I was doing this meandering, haphazard process. So what I decided to do when I could see, wow, these boundaries are amazing, I started reading about boundaries, and it helped me retroactively understand what I had been going through, what I had learned, what I did, what I didn't do. And while I was doing that reading, Vandana, I started taking notes, which often turned into images because I was visually depicting, like, what does that look like if it was physically represented in the world? Because I'm a visual person. Well, those drawings turned into handouts, and those handouts turned into a workbook, which is the backbone of my boundaries coaching program. So I came up with an accelerated process to teach people how to build boundaries so they don't have to do this meandering, haphazard path that I did. And so I mentioned I was working at Yale when I got into recovery. So 2.5 years into my recovery, I got laid off from Yale through a series of serendipitous events, started my own business, just started coaching, started the podcast because I was like, wait a minute, there is all of this amazing wisdom in recovery that I've
Yeah.
never heard of in all of my years
Hmm.
of personal development. I wanted to get it out into the world. That's why I started the podcast. It never occurred to me it would have anything to do with my business. It's now the number one way that I get clients because people know me by the time they've listened. They know, they feel like they know me. And I'm like, well, if you listen to my podcast, you do. So I started coaching, doing my podcast, and I was just sort of like coaching. I wasn't really focusing on I mean, mostly people in recovery, but not everybody. And then it was pretty clear I needed to have a niche, and just boundaries just made
Yeah.
total sense to me because I had been starting to develop this curriculum. I had done workshops at the ACA World Service office, a couple of different conventions,
Okay,
and it
cool.
just made sense for me. And so I became a boundaries coach. I've been doing that for 4 years now. I do private coaching for anybody, and then I have group programs for women. And it's just, I was saying to somebody the other day, I mentioned I'm a compulsive overeater. Well, years ago, I worked for Weight Watchers, and one of the reasons I got a job with them is so I would keep the weight off.
Hmm.
And as soon as I left, I gained all the weight back, by the way. And
Hmm.
I think one of the reasons that I subconsciously became a boundaries coach is that there's no way that I'm going to let go of my boundaries when I'm coaching on it all day long, every day with everybody. And it's like
Mm.
becoming a
Right.
sponsor. Like we become a sponsor in recovery to help us strengthen our recovery. I am a boundaries coach, not just because I want for other women, especially, the kind of freedom and relief in my life and control over my life that I've gotten. I want that for them. And I want to strengthen my recovery as a well-boundaried person.
Yeah, of course. When you help others, you help yourself. It's just like a two-way
Absolutely.
street. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Wow, that's amazing. And I could definitely relate to the Weight Watchers part. I've been on and off that my whole life. And again, like adult children tend to, carry like because of the unmet needs, we tend to stuff our feelings. So a lot of us tend to eat or overeat compulsively, or just like not eat what we should be eating. So like
Mhm.
maybe
Mhm.
things like in my case, I feel like because I had an overbearing mother who actually put me on Weight Watchers when I was 12. So anything that I really enjoyed, she snatched away from me, and I felt very
Mm.
deprived. So there's a lot of
Oh,
emotional deprivation,
yeah.
and that's
Mhm.
still tied up into foods, like certain comfort foods that I feel like I must have, or else I'm not going to survive. Or
Right.
or I just wouldn't be as happy or calm
Mhm.
or something. So and that's a whole nother conversation, I think.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
so this boundaries worksheet that you created, how does that work if someone, whoever's listening, people want to like check that out? Can you give like
So
a
it's
synopsis or a thumbnail about how that works?
yeah, so it's actually a workbook, and I used to sell it
Okay.
individually to anybody, and I decided I can't do that anymore because they need the coaching that goes along with it because
Yeah,
there's some pretty deep shit in there. Oops, sorry, I
that's
swear.
okay. No
Okay.
worries.
Yeah, actually, if you don't like swearing, don't listen to my podcast because I say that. But so I started with worksheets and then I
Yeah,
pulled them together into a workbook, and I have 12
right.
modules. But So I can describe some of it. So there,
Sure.
like the main metaphor that I use throughout my entire workbook is the idea of boundaries being related to property. And this is a common metaphor that many people use. So you
Mhm.
are your property. You are responsible for your property and nobody else's property. And nobody is responsible for your property. And then there are a variety of metaphors that kind of spring off from that. So another property metaphor is that having a boundary is like having a fence with a gate in it. So the fence itself, the boundary is your property, you're in charge of it. And when we say it has a gate in it, it means because you can let people in or not. And you're the gatekeeper and it only opens from the inside. Meaning, if someone is trampling on your boundaries, it's because you let them in. They
Yep.
didn't jump the fence. It's your property, it's yours to manage. So if you set a boundary with someone and they don't respect it, it's your job because you're your own property manager to do something about that. So another metaphor of property is to think of your precious resources of love, money, time, and energy as property of yours. And so what many of us do with our love, money, time, and energy is give it all away to other people and don't hold on to it for ourselves. Or maybe we don't give it all away, but we still don't give any to ourselves. Right. And so
Absolutely.
right. And so I absolutely, all of my financial problems I ever had in my life had to do with my codependence. That took me a couple years into recovery to realize that. I
Hmm.
declared bankruptcy in 1999 when my student loans came due because I couldn't handle the student loans on top of the credit card debt, which, by the way, was the second time I had racked up a bunch of credit card debt. And all of that was because either I was managing my image with other people, I was coming to the rescue of people, or I was buying their affection. I didn't know any of this at the time. It wasn't until I did the 12 steps and looked back at my behavior. It was like, oh my goodness. Right.
Can I
So
stop
all
you
of,
there for a minute? Is that
yeah,
okay?
absolutely.
I'd love to circle back to what you just said a minute ago, managing my image. Can you
Yes.
expand on that a little bit?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I didn't ever want to say I can't afford that or that's not in my budget, especially
Mm-hmm.
if it was really clear that people had more money than me, because I want people to think that I have it together at all times. 24/7, 365 days a year under every circumstance. Like I needed to project this image of like, I've got this. I have no flaws. I have no cracks in my foundation. And of course, that's really hard to manage, which is why I drank abusively until I was like in my early 40s and I smoked bales weed. I actually, when I first got in recovery, I was still smoking weed. Now I'm like clean and sober and abstinent and all that kind of stuff. But and I got like I didn't grow up overweight. I think the switch sort of I think of it as like the switch flipped for me in my early 20s to becoming a compulsive overeater. So I was numbing myself in all these ways because I didn't have it together 24/7 under all
I mean,
circumstances.
and who does, like honestly and
Well,
sincerely,
nobody,
who,
but we think because we compare our
right.
insides to other people's outsides. We
Yep.
compare our home movies to other people's highlight reels, you know? And so we feel like we're supposed to have it together all the time. And I actually want to share a word that I heard on a recovery podcast that really changed that for me. I
Okay.
don't know if you've heard this before, but it's the word flawsome, FLAWESOME. So it's
I've
flawed and awesome mixed
never,
together. And when I heard that, I was like, wait a minute. So hearing that concept kind of brought me out of my black and white thinking of I'm either flawed or I'm awesome and helped me see the gray. And I started to internalize like, wait a minute,
mhm.
it's normal to have flaws. And then as I started to internalize that and get okay with the fact that I had flaws, I stopped judging myself so much and I started relaxing and allowing other people in and allowing them to see my flaws, which is how we create that's vulnerability. And
Yep.
that's how we create intimacy with other people. And then as I relaxed my self-judgment, lo and behold, I stopped judging other people so much. So that
Mhm.
concept of being flawsome really helped me come out of that black and white thinking, at least in regard to that. I mean, I'm sure I know that I still have black and white thinking here and there. And often I need fellows in recovery to say things like, there's other options, right, Barb? Like sometimes I've got my black and white glasses on, so sometimes I can't see my own black and white thinking. I'm much, much, much better than I used to be, but there's still vestiges, of course.
Wow, wow, you just said a mouthful. So what about what's different about your podcast that you said that you mentioned that you've really like dropped your like lowered your barriers and you
Mhm,
don't really have you're very vulnerable and you
mhm,
really speak truth. So can you
mhm,
tell us a
mhm.
little bit about that while I plug in my battery?
Yeah, absolutely. So my podcast episodes are 10 to 20 minutes. I think of it as me sharing my experience, strength, and hope of recovery. And I
Yeah.
really, like, I started it, as I said, to carry the message, but I also had gotten reflected back to me many, many, many times by fellows in recovery. Barb, when you talk, you help me connect the dots. Now, Vandana, I don't know how I'm doing that. I'm just talking, but there's something about the way that I share that I'm able to share my emotional experience and my conceptual understanding of things and my pulling things together in a way that is helpful to people. I don't know why. It's a gift that I don't take responsibility for. It feels like it's a higher powered thing. And I share personal stories from my own recovery, from my fellows in recovery, from my clients, and we connect with other people by stories. Think about in the rooms when you hear someone else tell a story, you're like, oh my God, that's me. Or like, I never realized that about myself. We can see ourselves in
Mhm.
stories. And so I tell a lot of stories. I also don't like I don't sugarcoat things, but I'm also not a dick about it, you know? And I'm really honest about my foibles, you know, like so what just popped in my head was one of my earliest episodes was about denial, which when I heard the acronym, don't even notice I'm a liar, I was like, oh my God, because
Oh,
when
I
I
have to write that down.
when I got in recovery, I thought I was an honest person. I truly believed that I was an honest person. Oh my God, I lied about cigarettes, I lied about drugs, I lied about alcohol, I lied about relationships, I lied about managing my image, but I mostly lied in the people pleasing department. So I didn't even know that I was a liar. So I did this episode, and like 2 weeks later, I was wiping down the table in my kitchen, and all of a sudden, I'm like, oh my God, that was a lie. Holy shit. So I recorded another episode like 2 weeks later. I was like, this is the story I should have told, but I didn't even know. So do you want me to tell you
Oh,
this brief story?
I mean, yeah, we definitely have time, but don't even notice I'm a liar is the true meaning of denial, or at
Yes.
least a unique meaning for adult children. So, and
Yes.
also I'd love for you to share a little bit about that term that was coined by someone from ACA many years ago, I believe, because I still don't think a lot of people understand what an adult child is or
Mhm.
might misunderstand it
Yeah.
or,
Okay,
and take
sure.
it the wrong way. So I'd love to, yeah, those two things.
Okay, sure. So the story is this. My last boyfriend before I got into recovery, um, I'm not going to say his name.
No, please
So
don't.
a year into dating him, I had my gallbladder out and he didn't even come and visit me. So I decided that I was going to go to his house so that, quote, he could take care of me. And that's not what happened. So I was recovering from abdominal surgery. And while I was there, I rearranged the furniture in his house so that the room that had been used as an office that they were referring to as his daughter's room, his daughter never came to his house anymore. And his son, who came over all the time, was sleeping in the living room. So I changed it so that that boy could have a room with a closed door that he could sleep in when he stayed over. And so I said that I was there for him to take care of me. It took me years into recovery to even allow myself to realize that was a lie. I was there to take care of him. And what happened after me spending that week there is what
Mm.
I said to him was, oh my God, I love being with you so much. I think we should move in together. Meanwhile, I had told him when we met, I will never live with you unless we're married because I had lived with several men before. And he would say to me after we moved in together, thank you so much for breaking your number one rule, which he could have been saying to me, thank you for not honoring your own boundaries. And what I now
Mm.
know is that what happened when I stayed with him for that week, it was like, oh, this is codependent enough for me. this is good. This feels comfortable. I'm going to move in. But I was in denial about that. So that day I was wiping down the table and all of a sudden I went, oh my God, it was a lie. I didn't go to his house to get taken care of by him. I went to him to take care of him
Right.
because it was really clear. He didn't even come and see me at my house after my surgery. Right. So I had to go to him because that's what I
Yeah.
was used to doing.
Right.
So so back to the term adult child. So my understanding is that, first of all, the roots of ACA are that some Alateens outgrew Alateen and they went to Al-Anon and they were like, we don't fit here because those are our parents. Maybe not literal, our actual parents, but they
Right.
didn't feel comfortable in the room. So they were literally adult children of alcoholics. So it described them, they were the children of alcoholics who are now adults. Over time, it made sense that not just are many of us adult children of alcoholics, but we are adults walking around with the emotional and psychological structures of a child. We are stuck emotionally in our childhoods. And so we respond and react to life
Thank
with the
you.
patterns of our childhood. What happened over time is they realized, wait a minute, you just don't need to be the child of an alcoholic to qualify. It could be any kind of addiction or any kind of dysfunction. So it could be your parent had a personality disorder, a chronic illness. It
A
could be,
narcissist.
right, it could be some kind of mental illness. It could be
Hmm.
a super militaristic, any kind of rigidity or really too much looseness, like neglect. It could be
No boundaries.
hyper-religiosity,
Zero
right, no
boundaries.
boundaries.
Yeah.
So all of those things result in the dysfunction. And what has come out in research around the same time as ACA, the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, which was a longitudinal study, showed that this is the result of intergenerational family dysfunction, and the result is childhood trauma. And so, what many people, when they think of trauma, they think of what is often called big T trauma. So, blunt trauma. You were
Hmm.
attacked, you were in a hurricane, you were in a war zone. And that is, of course, really important. But what happens for most people that are in ACA is what's often called little T trauma
Hmm.
or relational trauma. I call it like the drip, drip, drip of emotional invalidation, that was my particular trauma, and gaslighting, where, your parents or your caregivers are telling you things are true that are not, and you're questioning your own reality. And that,
Hmm.
honestly, for me, Vandana, was the worst effect for me growing up in
Yeah.
dysfunction, was that I question my own perception. And if
Yeah.
you don't even trust your own perception, what kind of a life can you possibly have? You're not going to make good judgments about who are safe people, who are trustworthy people, who are the kind of people you want to surround yourself with. And thus, when I did my relationship inventory in ACA, there were 20, I happened to date men, so it was all men on it, 28 men on it. And that was everybody from I dated them to a few times to I'd lived with them for a number of years at a time.
Mhm.
And when I did that inventory, I could see my codependence get worse and worse and worse and worse over time.
Yeah.
And so 3.5 years into my recovery, I met my sweetheart, and he was also in recovery. He doesn't go any longer. Have him tell his story. He was a very different man. He was married for 10 years and then he was married for 25. And so recovery really changed him. And so we both were able to be in a relationship in a way that we didn't know was possible before. And
Right.
I think, one of the things that attracted me the most to him in the beginning was that he had really healthy boundaries. And I learned how to effectively communicate by building boundaries. I learned what was okay with me and what was not okay with me by building boundaries. I learned what I want, like, need, and prefer. And because I know all those things and I know how to communicate, I communicate those things to him as they come up, and he communicates with me. So
Yeah.
we nip things in the bud. The other thing is that, I was 55 and he was 60 when we met. I'm 61 and he's now 66. So in a couple weeks, we'll have our 6-year anniversary. And we are living apart together. We learned that that's a thing, LATs, a thing that's happening among older adults, where we are committed life partners, but we live separately. We will not be getting married. We will not be combining our households. We will not be combining our finances. And this is a decision that we have made consciously together. These are boundaries we have drawn in our relationship.
Hmm.
Whereas my entire life before, I was always on the way to moving in and maybe getting married with someone. That was just like that was where you went. And when
Right.
I
That
got
was
in
the goal, the
recovery,
dream. Right.
right, when I got in recovery, I, was like, well, I mean, I wouldn't say that changed because when I started dating him, here's what's funny is I had this idea in my head before I met him. The ideal marriage to me would be we live in a three-family home where you have a floor, I have a floor, and we have a shared floor. And we don't go to each other's floors unless invited. Well, I meet him and he owns a three-family house. So I was like, perfect. But a couple months into dating him, I was like, wait, no, that's the momentum of my old ways of being.
Mm. So
That's not what I want to.
another lie.
Right, another lie. And so then I was like, wait,
Yeah.
I love my home and where I live, and I love his home for him. I don't ever want to live
Mm.
there.
Mm.
And so we just, we talked about it and we're like, he's not interested in getting married again. I don't really want to get married. I'm 61. I've never combined my finances with another person. I'm not doing that.
Mm.
And it helps us keep the romance together because we don't have to argue about money or chores, which is the main things that people are like division of
Right.
labor that most people argue with. And every once in a while, I have this little like, it's not like real intimacy if we're not living together. And it's like, no, this is the level of intimacy that we've chosen. We've chosen not to bring our finances together. We've chosen not to bring our households together. We've made this conscious decision together. So these are boundaries we have in our relationship. And it works for him and it works for me. And that's all that matters because we're the only two in the relationship. And other people might judge us. Go ahead. We're having a great time.
And that's great. And congratulations. And the only reason it works is because you've both put in the work. You've both
Mhm.
done the inner work for so long, which are
Yes.
the 12 steps of recovery. And
Yes.
I'd love to have you back so we can get into the 12 steps of recovery
Sure.
because they're really different from other organizations like
Mhm.
what is it like besides AA, there's like Naranon, Al-Anon, and then there's all of these
Well,
different,
there's
there's
literally
even,
hundreds.
I
Yeah.
mean, OA, Overeaters Anonymous, like, yeah, there's for every kind of addiction, there's like
Yeah.
a group. And this is not necessarily to plug like ACA, but it is a way of like helping others like hope, strength, and recovery so that if someone feels really alone and isolated and like you whoever's listening feels like your life is not manageable, and you've hit a rock bottom or maybe a series of many rock bottoms in your life and you really need support, you could just
Hmm.
pick up the phone and find a meeting all over the world, like every country, every city and state, and
Hmm.
on Zoom, on the phone, in person, which is supposed to be the best, but I never found one in person.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is a great way. I mean, and in addition to therapy and
Hmm.
whatever other support system you need, but I think it's great to do both,
Yeah, yeah, agreed. Yeah, I was in therapy when I got into ACA and then I left. But to be perfectly honest with you, I mean, I had therapists, like I said, for 37 years, I was in therapy.
yeah.
And literally not one of the things that came up in my first like 2 to 3 years of recovery, none of that shit ever came up in any of my therapy. Nobody ever
Yeah.
told me, you're an adult child, you have intergenerational family dysfunction, you have trauma, you have no boundaries, you lie, you're a compulsive overeater, you have a substance abuse problem, you have wildly unrealistic expectations, you are basically not accepting reality. None of that, none of those things came up in 37 years of therapy. So
Wow.
I'm sure I know that there are plenty of really good therapists out there, but there's a lot of really shitty therapists out there. So if you are not getting the kind of help that you really want, if you're not changing, get another therapist. That's what I have to say. And I think
Yeah.
now we're starting to understand trauma is everywhere. It permeates human history. If you think about the
It's
history of
collective.
human
Yeah, it's
is
everywhere in the
is
world. You could see
of
it playing out.
war and rape and pillage. Every culture has
Yeah.
had that going on. And so we have that in our DNA. And
Yes.
so we have some level of trauma. And so working with someone who is a trauma informed therapist is really important. But again, even if they say that they're trauma informed and you feel invalidated, or you feel triggered by them, or you feel like they're not giving you the help that you want and need, get
Yeah.
someone else.
Yeah, and we have free will, right? We have a choice. If something doesn't work, you can make another choice. You're allowed to do that.
Yeah.
And
And
it doesn't
actually,
matter if you think like you're have this fantasy, this compulsive thought or obsessive compulsive thought, like, oh, I can't because I already am obligated. I already had a few sessions with this therapist, so now it's too late. I have to stick with it because that's like
no.
another like cognitive dissonant thought, like that's how we wind up sabotaging and hurting and harming our own inner children because we're
Mm-hmm.
so used to not having a voice or feeling
Mm-hmm.
like we have the freedom
Yeah.
to make another
Yeah.
choice. So that's a really great point. I've also gone to therapists on and off since my divorce many years ago. And
Mm-hmm.
it's hard. It's really hard to find and to bond with somebody who is like professionally trained
Mm-hmm.
in trauma, who's a
Mm-hmm.
trauma informed therapist. It's not so easy. A lot of therapists, they're great, but they just specialize. They don't go deep. They're kind of
Mm-hmm.
like shallow on the surface, like they want you to be in the now to solve problems for you, to help you process
Mm-hmm.
um deeply repressed emotions or whatever blocks you have, but it doesn't never addresses somatically like what's happening in your
Mm-hmm.
body, why
Right.
aren't what's happening with your feelings, why are you so numb and frozen that you don't even seem to have any feelings, like, and that's really important. So they're very disembodied, I think, like they're very
Mhm.
cognitive behavioral,
Yeah.
CBT, all
Yeah.
of that. And I still don't have the right person, but it's just, with this group with ACA, it's like amazing because
Yeah.
you always feel that support and you always feel heard, and
Yeah.
that's the main challenge that I think. Well, we
Mm.
don't feel heard, and so we have
Yeah.
this slogan when you're in a ACA meeting, and when everyone does their goes around the room and does a share and speaks whatever is going on for
Mhm.
them, speaks about what's happening. We always say, you are heard, you're
Yeah.
heard. And at first that used to bother me because it felt really like scripted, like it didn't. And I think it was more like it annoyed me because I didn't feel like it was authentic because I was
Yeah.
brought up by people who weren't authentic and who
Yeah.
actually didn't
Yeah.
would say things that they actually didn't mean.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
now I understand, like, oh yeah, that's real. Like, wow, it feels so unfamiliar being heard,
Yeah.
that it felt like there was some resistance at first. But
Yeah.
yeah, ACA is amazing. You're amazing. Would you like to share your website and your podcast links with us before we
Sure,
go?
sure. Can I just take like 30 seconds to just bring up something that you alluded to? You talked about
Yeah,
not feeling like we have choices or voices, and that's really about victim mentality. And that is hands down the number one mindset shift of my recovery was
yeah,
coming out of victim mentality. And I'm not the quintessential victim. I'm not the woe is me, the world is against me, I can never win. I've never been like that. My victim mentality was much more subtle. It was things like, well, if only he would XYZ, then everything would be okay. Or me blaming other people, which means I feel like I don't have anything to do with the situation, or me complaining a lot. So I do want to just like put that out there. Like that's a huge part of being an adult
yeah.
child. In terms of my website, I think the best place for people to go is I just released something called a boundary building starter kit. So if
Mhm.
you go to boundariesstarterkit.com, it actually takes you to my homepage where you can sign up for the starter kit. And it is some of my absolute best work. It's all free and includes, it's multimedia. So there's videos, there's an article, there's a couple worksheets.
Oh,
And then
wow.
I have, as of this moment, 284 episodes of my podcast. Over 35 of them are exclusively about boundaries. So in the starter kit is the playlist of just the episodes about boundaries. So no matter how you take in information, video, reading, audio, there's something for you in there. And it's pretty comprehensive. If you're a social media person, I love to hang out on Instagram at a Higher Power Coaching, and on LinkedIn, I'm at Barb Nangle. That's N as in neighbor, Angle.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Barb. I'm definitely going to check out your boundaries workbook, because we
Well,
all
the
have that
workbook is
issue.
not for sale. The workbook is not for sale. You have to coach with me
The
to get
other one then, the
the
kit.
starter kit.
The
Yeah.
starter
Yeah.
kit, yes,
Yeah.
boundariesstarterkit.com, was it?
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. And again,
Oh, thank you.
my name is Vanzana, and I look forward to the next episodes with everyone. And I hope you find this podcast helpful, and empowering, inspiring. Please share it, like it, subscribe to the podcast, Adult Children in Recovery, Moving from Insanity to Serenity. Thank you
Nice.
so much, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.